Hello, and welcome to the next part of our Chapter a Day series working through the book of Genesis. Today we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 47. We're drawing toward the end of this book, and it's been quite a journey going from the very beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, watching how God displays his power, his nature, his character, how God helps us understand step by step who he is, but also helps us understand ourselves and why we are where we are in our world. Helps us understand how God is seeking to correct what is broken in our world. How he's doing it in a journey through people as he interacts with them, as he reveals himself to them, as he guides them and invites them to be partakers with him in his divine promise. We've been following specifically one generation, the generation of Jacob's children, his 12 sons, specifically Joseph, one of the 12, and how God has used him to be an instrument of salvation for his family. Used him to be in a position at the right time to help preserve and provide for the promise of God. So let's get right into the chapter. We're in chapter 47. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." So we have the first part here, following from chapter 46, where Joseph reminded his brothers and his father, when you come before Pharaoh, when you come before the king of Egypt, and he asks you, "What is your occupation?" to tell him basically the truth: you're shepherds. You care for livestock. That's what you've done. That's what your father's done. That's what your grandfather did. Because when they say that to Pharaoh, they remove any fear Pharaoh may have had of having this people group suddenly enter into his kingdom. Because in Egypt, the lowest social position in Egypt were those who cared for the livestock, who cared for the sheep and goats, the shepherds. So there's no danger of them trying to take position or power in Egypt. And Pharaoh goes so far as to say, if there's any among this group that are capable, hire them and they can care for my livestock, care for the livestock of the king as well. So this is another way, we talked about it in chapter 46, how God is providing, protecting, preparing this people as they come into their audience with Pharaoh. And now they have royal permission to settle in the land of Goshen. Verse 7. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." So Pharaoh is introduced to Jacob. And it's interesting as we hear this exchange of how Jacob speaks about his life. Because Pharaoh asks Jacob the question, basically he asks him, how old are you? As this elderly patriarch is brought before him, the father of Joseph, his second in command, is brought before him, and Jacob says that he is 130 years old. And I love the language used here, the years of my sojourning, the years of my journey. I think that's an important way for all of us to look at the life that the Lord gives us. The life that we have is a journey that we are walking out with Him. We are walking out this life. God has a purpose and intention in all our lives. That first and fundamental purpose is that we would come to know Him through Jesus Christ. That we would be once again reinstalled in our creation purpose of being the image and likeness of God, displaying His nature and His character on earth. But it is a journey that we walk through with God, as we've been seeing introduced to the various people going through the book of Genesis, that each one of them was on a journey. Whether it was Abram on a journey, as God told him, leave all you know and go to a land that only I can show you. And his journey, at times when he strayed too far, when he strayed down into Egypt. When you think about it, Abram met a Pharaoh. Isaac, straying where he would go, met kings. And now we see Jacob brought before a king as well. But when Jacob talks about this journey, Jacob is aware of the problems in his journey. Jacob is aware of the struggles. Jacob's aware of the issues that's been a part of his journey. Because we think of Jacob's years, how he tricked his brother, how he tricked his own father, how he robbed his brother of his birthright and of his blessing, how he had to flee for his life, how he ended up with Laban, and how Laban tried to manipulate him in the same kind of way that Jacob would manipulate others. You think of the difficulty that was within their family life, where he was married to Leah yet did not love her, despised her, instead was married to Rachel, how Rachel couldn't have children it seemed at first, and Leah could, and all the tension that brought. His favoritism for the sons of Rachel over the sons of Leah. We think of what happens in this family. And then the disappearance of Joseph, and he thinking that Joseph is dead. And he went into perpetual mourning for years. He has not lived his life well in many ways, yet God has been faithful. And he makes the statement of the years of his sojourning compared to those of his father before him. He compares his life to his grandfather before him. He compares his life to Isaac's life, the length of his life and the journey of his life, and he compares his life to Abram's life. Abram, who became Abraham, and his life journey. It's a powerful time of reflection for Jacob in this moment. We can see what he's been thinking and processing, even in the events that have just happened and being reunited with Joseph. We see the man Jacob and the poignant statement that he makes when he says, "Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. So we have, after this moment of meeting, we have the moment of blessing, where here we have Jacob blessing Pharaoh. And when you think about that for a moment, you'd expect it to be the other way around. Here's the ruler, here's the one who is associated in his own culture with the divine, and here is this old man, this Bedouin, and yet it is Jacob who extends the blessing onto Pharaoh. Jacob, the sojourner, Jacob who walked down through the years, Jacob who has entered Egypt knowing that the God of his fathers has entered with him. Jacob blesses Pharaoh. It's a beautiful picture there. And then they're settled in the land, given what they need so that they can continue to grow as a people as God has intended. Then we switch into the next part of this chapter, and this is important because we're going to see something developing in this part of the chapter, and it can be a bit difficult as we're thinking it through, because here, in the next part of the chapter, again, Joseph is becoming an instrument. And as we look at it, we may wrestle a bit with what's happening here, because Joseph is becoming an instrument in order to create the necessary climate in Egypt for what needs to happen in the years ahead for the children of Israel. Joseph is becoming an instrument of design. And you're going to see what's happening here as we talk, because it all focuses around the famine and what it means for the people of Egypt. If you recall, Pharaoh had a dream, and in that dream, the dream had two stories basically, and both of them told the same message, that there was going to be years of plenty followed by years of famine. Years of plenty followed by years of famine. And to prepare for the years of famine, Joseph was given the responsibility to gather all the possible surplus from each year of plenty and store it away. So he set up granaries and storehouses all over Egypt, and with every bumper crop, he made sure everything possible from that was taken and stored properly away. So when the famine came, there is this massive amount of stored food, and it's all under the control of Joseph, the representative of Pharaoh. So now let's see what is happening in Egypt. Now there was no food in all the land. Verse 13, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So first, in order to get food, people had to use money. So they took the money they had. Money equaled food. So at first, the people from Egypt and the surrounding areas brought their money and bought food. That's what we saw Jacob's sons doing in the earlier chapters. They needed food. They gathered together some of the money they had and they went to purchase food. But notice what's going to happen. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone. So now we have a problem because the famine, of course, it's a 7-year famine. At first, they used the money they had. But of course, in an agrarian culture, they took the money, they bought food, they bought seed to plant, but then the next year's harvest fails as well. Well, now there's no new income coming in. So now the money is running out. And they said, but we still need food. We still need something to plant in the hopes of a harvest next year. And so this is what Joseph says. Verse 16, and Joseph answered, give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. So when the money ran out, they used their livestock. Now what this means is not necessarily that Joseph collected all up, but the ownership of the livestock became Pharaoh's. So now, instead of you owning a farm with so many goats and so many sheep and so many donkeys and so much cattle, now they were all the property of Pharaoh. You cared for them for him. He now was the owner of the livestock. Verse 18, and when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land may not be desolate. So the people come, and now they have no money, and they have no livestock. All they have left now, they have their land, because they had private ownership of that, and they have their lives. We see this is what happens. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. So to get food, the people gave up the private ownership of their land. Now all the land belonged to the king of Egypt. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Pharaoh said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants of Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 1/5. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So what we see happening here is because of the famine, the people of Egypt have moved from a society of which they were somewhat independent of the ruler to now being completely dependent. Completely dependent on Pharaoh. He now owns the land of the kingdom. He now owns the livestock. Everyone is in fact now a servant of his. The entire structure of the society has changed during the years of famine. This elevates the position of Pharaoh. This increases his power and influence because now everyone is his indentured servant. We need to understand this because this helps us understand the culture that will grow and develop in Egypt. The sweeping powers that the Pharaoh would have, the increased elevation of his position of being semi-divine, that we see that part of that journey took place through the famine. And as Pharaoh is elevated, then that becomes first the protection for the children of Israel, but it also is going to lead to their time of suffering. The time of suffering that God told Abraham about, of what was going to happen to the people in Egypt. Whether that has been carried on and been reminded to the children of Israel, it is something that is going to happen. This is becoming the Egypt that most of us think of when we think of Egypt in the ancient world. Let's continue. In verse 27. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. We come to this moment. We see how Israel, the people, the descendants of Jacob, are being cared for, provided for in Egypt. But then we have this picture of the end of the days of Jacob, now Israel. He knows that his days are drawing to a close. 147 years. 17 years have passed. The famine is long since done. The people are now producing again, and 1/5 of everything they produce is going to Pharaoh. He is becoming wealthier and wealthier, more powerful, more consolidated in his power. Meanwhile, this clan, this tribe, is growing and multiplying in Egypt. And Jacob knows that he is about to die. And so he calls Joseph to him, makes Joseph swear an oath to him that he won't bury him in Egypt. That Jacob in his death wants to go back to the promised land. That Jacob in his death wants to be with his father Isaac. Wants to be with his grandfather Abraham. And Joseph promises this. This picture of Jacob, even in his hard journey, even when he said that, my days have been evil and few and are not compared to my father's. Yet he has seen the Lord's provision in Egypt. For 17 years, he was able to witness his family grow, provided for, cared for in Egypt, God being with them. So when Jacob comes to die, and we'll see this over the next several chapters, his last words, we see how God is faithful. God is faithful in Egypt. God is faithful in the midst of all the things that are going on in Egypt, all the things that must come to pass. God is faithful. And we can take that and hold on to it. Even though there are things happening today in our world and things that we look at and go, why, Lord, are you allowing this to happen? Why are things going the way they are? Some things go because they are part of God's overworking plan. And He allows them to happen, even though they testify of our own rebellion against God, our own sinfulness. But in the end, God will accomplish His purpose, and His purposes will be good. And His purposes will reflect His character. And God will deal with those who act in rebellion. Though sometimes we don't see it. We don't understand the workings that are happening in governments. We don't understand the workings that are happening among nations. We don't understand that. So we cling to the fact that God is the one who spoke the universe into existence, is the one who was holy in the beginning and He's holy now, who makes plans that are greater than what we can see in the moment. So just as Jacob, after so many years of trouble, can in his old age look and see God's faithfulness. See His faithfulness as he looks at his clan, as he sees his sons and his grandchildren, and sees them growing and prospering. They may even been great-grandchildren by that point. 17 years they're in Egypt at this time when He calls Joseph to him, knowing that he will soon die. And how Jacob wants to go back to the land of promise, back to that place where God first brought that family, Abram and Sarai, brought them there and gave them a promise. God has given us promises. Promised He will never leave us or forsake us, that wherever He sends us to, He will always be with us, and He'll always see that we come home. That He who has begun a good work in us is faithful to see it through to completion. Those are the promises of God, even in the midst of things that are happening that we cannot understand. He is faithful and true. I hope you can believe that. I hope that you know God in a way that you can see that at work. That even in your days of trouble, in the days of evil, when your life hasn't looked like the life that you wanted it to look like maybe your predecessors or those around you, that you know that He's at work if you know Him through Jesus Christ. I hope this encourages you. I hope this has given you food for thought, things to wrestle with. I hope it blesses you. Thank you, and God bless.